In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the valve cover on this Toyota 4Runner. Let's get into it. Underneath the vehicle, we're going to take this shield down using a 13mm socket. Take the bolts out. There's two in the front. I'm going to slide the front part back and try to slide it down. There's a couple clips holding it in. And then the back part is going to slide forward. Right here, there is a drain on the radiator. If your radiator doesn't have a drain right there, you want to pop off the coolant hose. Make sure you have a drain bucket underneath. Just loosen up this drain. And just drain the coolant out. We're going to disconnect the battery, the negative terminal. Use a 10mm wrench. Loosen up the nut. And slide it off and out of the way. Disconnect the mass airflow sensor. There's just a little push tab. Just push that down. Slide the connector off. Just pop this retainer off right here. You can use some needle nose pliers. Just squeeze the tabs. That slides off, out of the way. There's another retainer right here. This one's broken. Just pull that aside as well. And over here, there's a retainer. And pop that off. Pop this hose out of the bracket right there. There's another hose right here. Just use some hose pliers. And just slide this off, just like that, out of the way. There's a hose up top. You can use some hose pliers. Just wiggle that back and forth. Slide that off. Set that aside. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to loosen up the worm clamps. That one there, and right here. Just grab the snorkel. Slide it off the throttle body and slide it off the mass airflow sensor. I'll just grab this hose. I'm just using some hose pliers. Just twist it and it slides right off. Disconnect the connector right here. Just push down on the tab. Slide the connector off. There's another connector over here. Push down on the tab and slide it off. Just going to use some pliers just to squeeze that. Slide that off. There's a connector down below here. Push down on the tab and slide that one off. Take this hose off right here. Just slide it down. If you need to, you can use pliers. Push that out of the way. All right, this hose right here, I'm just going to pull this out of this bracket. You might have to bend the bracket just slightly. Slide that out. And we have the cable that goes to the throttle body. Slide that out of the bracket. And there's a bracket right here. We want to take that bolt out. Using a 14mm socket. Now slide the cable off. Slide the end out. And set that aside. I'm going to take this hose off. I'm just going to use some hose clamp pliers. Squeeze that. And using some hose pliers, twist this back and forth and slide it off. Now we're going to take this bracket off that's connected to this line right here. That's the throttle cable line. Use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that bolt out right there, and then that can be set aside. Take this ground wire right here off. We're going to use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that off. We're going to pop this diagnostic connector off. I'm just going to use a pick, and there's a little tab in there. Slide back on that tab, and that slides up. That's the tab right there. Just set that aside. This hose that runs along the back, just pop that out of the bracket. Set that aside. Now we're going to loosen up the bolts and nuts for the intake manifold. We'll start over here using a 12mm socket. Just crack them free first. That's all of them. Grab the manifold. I'm just going to tip it up, and over here there is a hose for the PCV. Just pop that off. You can twist this out of the way so I don't have to disconnect the coolant hoses that go to the throttle body. Take this gasket off, just slide it off. You don't want to drop anything in there, so be careful. To prevent anything from falling in there, I'm just going to take some rags. I'll stuff it in there. You just need to remember to remove the rags before we put this back together. I'm going to clean up this gasket material. You can use a scraper or a razor blade, just be careful. Try to scrape away from the center where the holes are. And just take a rag and some brake parts cleaner and just clean this up a little bit. This hose right here and tube, we're going to take that off. Use a 12mm socket. Take the two bolts off for the brackets. Just going to use a 12mm wrench. Loosen this one up. You can take it out by hand. Grab the hose, just slide it to the side. In the back there's a bracket that's connected to the lower intake. Use a 10mm wrench, loosen that up. Take that off, that's separated. Underneath there's a hose that's attached to a bracket. You got to take those two bolts out. You're going to use a 10mm socket. Just move some of the other hoses out of the way. Alright, those are off. Now take this bolt off. Use a 12mm socket. Loosen that up. Alright, and that bracket's separated. There's some bolts we're going to take out on this side of the intake. Use a 12mm socket. There's a nut on the side here. Loosen that up. I'll just loosen them all first. Take the nut off. Grab the intake. Slide it up. And it slides right up. On the bottom of the throttle body, we're going to take these two hoses off. Just use some hose clamp pliers. Slide the clamps down. just using some hose pliers. Loosen these up. You can use regular pliers, just be careful not to squeeze it too much. Slide those off. And slide that off. Now just grab this upper intake and pull it out of the way. I'm just gonna plug up the holes with some rags so nothing falls down in there. This wiring harness right here, we're gonna have to take the 2 bolts out on the sides. There's one on this side, one on the other side. Use a 10mm socket, remove that bolt. The harness is clipped in underneath this cover. You're gonna have to feel for a little clip. Release that clip and you can slide the harness out of the way. There's a clip on the back side here as well. Slide that out so that you can move the harness a little bit. There is a coolant temp sensor on the back. Just squeeze that sensor. Try to slide that out just to give you some more room. You can get all the injector connectors disconnected. Just push down on the tab. Slide these out. Do the same on the other side. There's a connector right here. You want to disconnect this connector. Just push down on the tab. That's disconnected. We're going to remove this bracket. Use a 14mm socket. Loosen up this bolt. Slide that off. I'll pull the wires out. Just grab the wire. Give it a twist and slide it up. Should slide like that. And slide those out. You can label them if you think you're going to get them mixed up, but they should go back in the correct locations. You just need to pull this cover back a little bit. So we're going to pull the bolts out of the timing cover. Use a 10mm socket. Should be enough. I don't actually have to take that bottom one off. Just pull this back just a little bit. I'm just going to use a bungee cord and just find something to hook onto it so that you can just pull some of these lines out of the way, just to make it a little easier. These wires you can pull up and out of the way. This is an extra wire right here. This shouldn't be there. You should be able to just flip this up and out of the way. That's okay. We'll work around it. Using a 10mm socket, I'm going to take the bolts out on the valve cover. Now we'll take the 4 bolts out on the bottom. Grab the valve cover. And just pull it up. Sliding it up. And it'll be a little easier if you take this hose off. Slide that off. It slides right out. Now if the gasket's stuck to the engine, you want to take that off. Just taking a rag and some brake parts cleaner, just clean up the surface area where the gasket's going to sit. Take the oil cap off on the new valve cover. These seals are already installed. You can take the gasket, put the gasket on, line that up. It's pushed in all the way. That's good. On the gasket, you can see there's a couple little bumps right there and right there. We're going to just put a little dab of our TV in that location. And then on the corners as well, just a dab. Like that. To make it easier, I just used a bungee cord to hold this out of the way, hold the wires out of the way. And just carefully slide it in place. You don't want to scrape the RTV that you put on, and you don't want the gasket to fall out. Push it down. You can double check around, make sure the gasket didn't fall out. It feels pretty good. It's good. And take the bolts. If the washers are stuck to the valve cover, you want to take those up and put them back on the bolts. And get all the bolts started. Now we'll tighten these down. Go around, snug them down, and then we're going to torque these to 53 inch-pounds. It's just a good idea to go from the center and work your way out. There we go, 53 inch-pounds. You can always go back again and just double check, make sure everything's tight. Put that oil cap back on, just so nothing falls in there. Then I'm going to reposition the wiring harness, push the connector back onto that coolant sensor in the back. Lock that down. Connect all the injectors. the screws in that hold the harness down. Snug those down. Do the same on the other side. When you're replacing the valve cover gasket on the passenger side, the procedure is going to be the same, except you have 3 coil packs you have to take off. Take the 10mm bolt out, slide the coil pack off, then you can access all the bolts for the valve cover. Take the valve cover off, replace the gasket the same way as the other side. Take the plug wires and I'll line those up. And push those back on. These may clip on the timing cover. Put the timing cover back in. Get the bolts started. Take this bungee cord off where these hoses are. Install this hose. Slide it in position. Take this bracket, slide this in position, and get the bolt started. And we'll snug this down. You can tighten it up later once it's attached up top. Just going to use a little compressed air. And just take a rag with some brake parts cleaner and just wipe it down. That's good. At this point, I'll take these rags out. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Just take some compressed air. That's good. Take the gasket, line it up, slide it in position. Now I'm going to take a scraper or a razor blade and just clean up the gasket material on this middle intake. And take a rag, the little brake parts cleaner, and just wipe off any debris. That's good. And then you can do the same on the other side. We're going to do the same with the upper. Just scrape the gasket material off. And clean it up. Now take the intake, make sure some of the hoses are out of the way. Line these up, make sure it's lined up on the studs. Make sure all your hoses are at least going in the right direction. Now we can put the bolts back in. Now we'll snug these down. Torque those bolts to 13 foot-pounds. Now this bracket underneath here, we'll attach that, put the 2 bolts in. Tighten that down. Snug. Same with the other bolt. Now we can slide this connector right here, and this ground strap is going to go right here. Get that started and snug that down. And put the bolt in this bracket. Get that started. And you can snug the lower bolt as well. Take the back bolt, slide it through where the wiring harness goes on the back side here. Get that started. Snug that down. Now these 2 bolts for the bracket. Tighten those down. Take the rags out of here. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Put the gasket on. There should be a stud on this one. Put the stud in there. That's good. Take the upper intake, line this up. The studs are gonna go right there. Line the hoses up. It's for the PCV, and then the coolant hoses. If you took those off, you would put those back on. That's good. Get the bolts in. And the 2 nuts on the studs. Yep, snug those down. Torque these to 13 foot-pounds. Slide this hose over here. Use the hose pliers. Move that down. Take this bracket, line that up, and put the bolt in. Tighten that down. And slide this into the bracket right here. That's the throttle cable. Goes right there. Take the cable, slide it in position. Push it in. And get that lined up. Line the bracket up. Put the bolt in. Tighten that down. Connect the connectors. This hose, we'll slide this hose right on here. The other connector, Lock that in place. There's a connector down here. Plug that in. Take the snorkel, line it up. That's good. There's a hose up here. I'm gonna line that up. Push that on, make sure it's in the bracket. There's a hose right here. Slide that tube on. Tighten down the worm clamps. This hose right here, it's gonna go right there. Connector, line the connector up. Plug it in. If this retainer was in somewhere, you want to plug that back in. Right there. This should go right here. And it goes right there. Now connect the negative terminal and tighten it down. And snug it up. We'll put the drain plug for the radiator back in. And snug that down. Now take the shield, slide it in the middle, in the back. Let's get a clip on there. Clip it on the front. Right there. Get the bolts started. And put the other two bolts in. And snug these all down. Now we're going to add the coolant. Take the radiator cap off, just twist to the left. Slide that off. Now I'm going to use a funnel to add the coolant. You don't have to use a funnel, but it helps. Now we're going to add the appropriate coolant, a 50-50 mix. After it's all full, you can take the funnel off, put the cap on, make sure the reservoir has plenty of coolant in it, and run the vehicle for about 15 to 20 minutes. Constantly monitoring, make sure the engine is not overheating. After that, shut it down, let it cool, and double check your level.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.